Welcome back to the Time for Heroes podcast. On the podcast today, I've got Dan Jennings, who is a journalist, radio presenter, podcast host, and most recently, author. Dan did the Paul Weller fan podcast, and through that, he's brought out the official autobiography called Dancing Through the Fire. And it was Paul Weller's idea to get him to do it, to save him the time. So we're going to talk about all this, but what I like to do is get right back to the start, Dan. What was it like for a young Dan Jennings growing up?
Well, look, Martin, thank you for having me on. It's lovely to be here. What was it like growing up? I mean, I don't know if we'd have ever referred to ourselves as working class, but it was a working class family. That wasn't something you kind of talked about as a kid particularly. But my dad was a painter and decorator. My mum looked after us boys, did a bit of part-time work and stuff like that. But, you know, we didn't have loads of money. It was always a struggle to kind of make ends meet, I think. But we had a really great childhood. You know, I've got a younger brother, Matt, who's a couple of years younger than me. And we were kind of, as kids, like, thick as thieves, as the song goes. And, yeah, it was great. It was happy. We were in Essex. I grew up in Basildon in Essex, which is famous for Depeche Mode and Alison Moyet, I think. And now myself as a published author, maybe. But yeah, certainly those lots. So, no, it was good. It was happy, man. It was, we didn't have loads of money, but we had a nice childhood.
And what was, like going through school and growing up, what was the kind of ambitions? What did you want to be? Was it always journalism?
No, so as a kid, I think initially I wanted to be a fireman, and then I got locked in a bathroom at my nan's house, and the fire brigade had to come out and let me break down the door, and I thought, I don't want to do that as a job. That's not fighting fires, that's sorting out idiots. From a very young age, I loved music, and I loved radio, so I discovered radio presenters such as Emperor Roscoe and Caesar the Boogeyman, who was on Invicta Radio in Kent, and I lived in Essex, but you could just about get like a really crackly signal at midnight on him. So I used to listen properly under the bedclothes when I should have been sleeping, bed sheets rather. And I've discovered Chris Evans. So this was pre-Big Breakfast and pre-TFI Friday and his world kind of exploding. I discovered him on GLI, the Saturday show, and I just loved it. I just thought that sounded like the best job ever. So I wanted to work in radio. And as a 15-year-old kid, I started doing hospital radio. I then started doing work experience at the BBC as part of a GCSE and just fell in love with it. Yeah, it was radio. That was all I wanted to do, really.
Brilliant. And did you go further education into that? Obviously, I done an HNC in media studies.
Right.
To which point I then got a job in Royal Mail, which I've been with for 23 years, and I never used any of these qualifications up until 2020 when I started a podcast. So what was your kind of dealings with education?
Yeah, so I did GCSEs, and then halfway through I was doing A-levels. I was good at maths, so I got an A in GCSE, and I was all right at some other bits and bobs, but I was halfway through A-levels and as part of the A-levels, I don't know why, I can't remember now, but for some reason I was also doing a communication GCSE. I think because they hadn't introduced it until that same year, maybe. So I tagged that on, knowing that I could then get this work experience at the BBC in Somerset. And halfway through A-levels, I could just kind of made myself really useful at the Beeb, and they offered me a job. And it was that thing of, do I stick around and finish my A-levels, or do I get on the actual ladder and start working in an industry that I really wanted to work in? So I quit and left what was called college, oddly, but it was like secondary school, that sixth form. Went into radio. I got a job at the BBC, moved up to Bristol, and then they trained me up how to be a journalist and a producer and a reporter and eventually a presenter and all that. But yeah, I kind of quit, I guess, the education. I think I finished the GCSE, if I remember rightly. And at that point, yeah, the job came along and I quit the A-levels halfway through.
That's brilliant. That's the sort of opportunity I needed. My dream was to be the next John Motson.
Right.
Grew up listening to BBC 5 Live, listening to all the English commentary, and that was my dream. But I flunked out in my second year HNC, and then that was me into the world of work.
Well, I used to do so when I was at BBC Bristol. One of the things I eventually ended up doing was sport commentary, and I used to go off to what would have been the conference then. So teams like Yeovil Town and Cheltenham, was it, or Chippenham, and yeah, and commentate off-air commentary, but they'd use the little clips. So when you hear somebody going, kind of going, go, or they'd come over to me and I'd have to report at half time or whatever. And it was the hardest thing. By that stage, this is towards my end of my time at the BBC before I moved to commercial radio. I was really experienced. I've been at the B for about 8 years. That was the hardest thing, football commentary, and trying to think of different ways to essentially say he's kicked it. It was so hard, and I don't think I've got as mini discs somewhere. I dread to listen to them, but it was so hard, and I just thought, I can't do this. Although, Jeff Twentyman, who was the guy he was an ex-Bristol Rovers footballer. He was the guy who ran BBC Sport there in Bristol. He was like very complimentary, but that was such a hard gig, man. I have full respect. People like Ali Bruceball, who now does, he does all the Premiership and stuff. He was one of my work colleagues. And I just could tell that he was much better at that than me, so I was never going to get to do that. Jenny Gow, when I moved to commercial radio, Jenny Gow, who now does Formula One, was my co-host on Breakfast at Orchard FM in Somerset. And I could never do what those people do. She's brilliant as well,
So what sort of jobs then did you do within the radio, and how did you work your way up?
Yeah, so I started out just answering the phones and making cups of tea and all that. And then when I moved to Bristol, I was like a news assistant, and it was because they moved over to away from tape machines, so reel-to-reel tape, which was how everybody edited. So you kind of, you put this little white mark on the tape, you cut it with a razor blade, you stick it back together, all that. And then we moved over to computers, which sounds ridiculous now, doesn't it? But this would have been 93, 94. And I was basically the kid who knew how the computers worked. So I was the news assistant, and I'd show people how to kind of, do little edits on the computer, things that become now are so easy, and everybody's got these on their phones, for goodness sake. We had these massive computers that we'd edit interviews. So I did news. They trained me up to, I was kind of like a researcher, and then they trained me up to be a presenter, and I hosted the early show on BBC Bristol. I then I got given the Saturday show, Saturday Breakfast on BBC Bristol. And this would have been, I'd have been like 17, 18. And the audience figures for the Saturday Breakfast show were bigger than the weekday breakfast show, at which point nobody at the BBC was very happy, because they were obviously paying the breakfast guy, and the weekdays a huge amount of money, not me. And so they said I was too young to do it at that point. So they then took me off air, and I became like more of a producer, but I used to fill in for loads of people's shows when they were on holiday and things like that. And that's why I left the BBC, actually, because a bit ego, really. I wanted my own name above the door. I wanted my own show. So I moved to commercial radio and did breakfast shows for probably another 8 years, something like that. I was in Somerset doing breakfast show, and I did Gatwick, Mercury, which is near Gatwick in Crawley. I did drive time on 210,
My message is for Crawley. I'm going to... When would that have been? What years?
That would have been, let me think. So that would have been 2003, 2004 for a few years. And that was Dan and Joe, the morning crew, I think we were called.
Yeah, I'm going to speak to her tonight, see if she listened to you.
I mean, I miss an elements of that. I don't miss all of it, don't get me wrong. I certainly don't miss those early mornings and getting up at 4:30 in the morning or whatever.
Well, that was going to be my next question. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, there'd be a lot of times where I'd go out, I'd go on a date and I would fall asleep during the date, because you would get so tired, and there becomes a point where your body clock kind of packs up and doesn't, so your body rather packs up, and you just can't kind of cope with that kind of time of day, and you're constantly feeling sick. And it was just, it got to a point where when I did the really early show on BBC Bristol, well, the show was 5 till 6, and then I used to drive the desk for the big breakfast show. And you'd have to get up at 3:30 in the morning. I mean, I was like 17, 18 or something, wanting to go out with all my mates, and you couldn't. It was horrendous. So, there was a time, after a long period of time, where your body just goes, I can't do this anymore. It's awful.
Yeah, I mean, hats off to you, because, I mean, when you're presenting these shows as well, you need to be loud and out there and full of energy. It's such
and also you need to live a
time.
life. You need to live a life to have something to talk about on the show the next morning, to have content. And if you haven't done anything, because all you've done is napped all day long. Even when I used to go to the cinema, because I love cinema, and I go to the cinema in the afternoon, and then I just sleep through the entire film. People were like, what did you think of the film? I have no idea. I slept through the whole lot.
I think I'm like that now, though, with any film that I put on. I'm 20 minutes in and
Oh yeah, certainly, yeah.
I think that's just an age thing now.
Well, the cinemas now have these reclining seats, don't they? So you can like properly lie back. It's like, that's no good for the cinema experience. I'm just going to I'll be snoring in 10 minutes.
So, like for the breakfast show, did you then move up to drive time or anything like that?
Yeah, so I moved around a bit. Drive Time at 210 was probably the bigger commercial station, and that was like a big regional station. But the thing was, this is a point at which I fell out of love with it. So what used to happen, a lot of those types of radio, so breakfast you could talk and you could be more creative and you could do some fun things. Those types of shows then, the Drive Time show was what was called known as more music, less talk, or more music, less chat. And it was basically people who are listening to the music. They want to hear the music. They don't want to hear, the DJ prattling on. And I did it. There was a thing, we used to get given playlisted music. So I wasn't picking my favourite songs. I was playing what the radio station had researched and told, audiences had told them to play. And there was a note on the log. It's on this paper log you get given every day of when you could talk and whatever. And it said 10 seconds, speed link. And I did 13 seconds. And the program director said, you did 13 seconds. And I was like, yeah, but was it any good? It doesn't matter. It was 13 seconds. And at that point, I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. This is rubbish. So I left. And I moved behind the scenes in radio. So I moved up to, and I could never really get onto national. That was the thing I wanted to do. I wanted to be on Radio 1 and all that, So I moved behind the scenes. But at that point, I then moved up to Magic and Q Radio, which hilariously, I got the job and I was behind the scenes, commercial programming. So like branded content, advertising, that type of thing. And, the week I joined, I was so excited because I loved Q and I thought it was brilliant. And the week I joined, they closed Q Radio. So I was left with Magic, which I grew to love, but it wasn't a station I listened to. And then they bought Absolute Radio, which I loved. So, I was behind the scenes, I think, in radio for pretty much 10 years before I left that. And then at that point, then started the podcast, which we'll talk about in a bit. But yeah, I kind of had been in radio probably at that point for 25 years, something like that, maybe.
Right. So, like coming off air, then it must have been a wrench. Like, see, like now, how do you go about listening to radio? Does it can you listen to radio, or does it annoy you that
No, I don't listen to a lot of radio. I'll be honest, mainly because of that thing of like, actually, if I'm gonna listen to the music I love, well, I'll just listen to the music I love. So I listen to music all the time, and the fact that we've now got smart speakers. And I've got it on my phone and I can listen to my headphones if I go for a walk. So I don't listen to a huge amount of radio. I loved Christian O'Connell when he was on Absolute and I used to listen to that breakfast show all the time. And then he left and went to Australia. So I didn't really kind of find a replacement. So no, I'm not a massive radio listener these days, I'll be honest. I tend to I listen to a bit of Six Music and a bit of Five Live with the sport if there's something on that I can't see on the telly. But generally speaking, I would say I listen to my music most of the time now.
I'd be interested to have a look at the listening figures for radios these days because, again, as you said, like with Spotify and stuff like that, I mean, like I work night shift, so Christ, it must be about 15, 20 years for I listen to a breakfast show.
They are massive. It's weird. It is massive still. It's huge. Less so amongst young people. And I think that's the challenge that radio has now is how do you get young people to listen when what they want to do is watch things on YouTube. But actually the audience figures for stations like Absolute and Magic and Capital and Heart and the BBC to a certain extent, although BBC local radio is struggling, they're bigger than ever. More people listen to radio now than ever before. It's crazy. That's probably because I'm not on it.
Well, that's it. I mean, obviously, like these shows, like the morning show and the drive time show, when you got your people commuting. But obviously, with myself, I don't commute at the times, and I walk to my work. I listen to Spotify, but obviously, if I discovered podcasting, even that kind of takes over the music. Like I would rather listen to like an hour long podcast than I would listen to my music nowadays.
Right.
So I guess that kind of takes us into that then. So like when you're kind of left radio, what was you thinking? How long was it before, and how much a niggle was the need to start a podcast?
It wasn't there really. I'll be honest. I didn't miss it. I thought I would at that point, but I really didn't. I kind of I was working with some really great presenters and producing like the branded content stuff with them, and I moved more into project management as well. So yeah, I thought I would, because it's that thing of, like I say, it's like I grew up and that's all I wanted to do. But I suppose I had a good stint at it. That I was in radio in total for a long period of time. But yeah, so there wasn't a kind of itch to be scratched, if you know what I mean. It was like, and actually the podcast wasn't that either. It wasn't really a kind of, I'm dying to get back on air in a sense, or to hear my own voice in a way. It was kind of, it was created in lockdown. It was that kind of thing of, would be good to do something. And I knew I could do it. I knew I could. And actually one thing I suppose I did miss about radio was interviewing people. Actually, that's something I always loved. So, but yeah, it wasn't kind of like a desire to get back into radio or anything like that. It was more of it'd be quite fun to do this. I could chat about Paul Weller with some fans for a bit, and thinking it would fizzle out. Don't get me wrong. I wasn't thinking of this kind of end goal. I just thought it would be just a bit of a laugh for maybe 10 weeks while we were in lockdown, and then we'd get back to normality because the pandemic would finish, and and I forget about it.
Yeah, and well, and then we touch on it like 4 years on,
Yeah.
and look where we're at. So, like the initial, the first episode with Stuart Debo, that's right.
Yeah.
Um, how did you go about kind of contacting him, convincing him? Because obviously it's a podcast that's never been out as such. So how do you go convincing a guest to come on your the first episode?
Yeah, so Stuart was, at that point, he had a book coming out, which was about the Style Council, called Soul Deep. And he just announced pre-orders for it. And it's funny, actually, because just before I started the podcast, I'd come off social media for about 6 months. I just got sick of the whole thing, of just, this kind of volatile, hatred, horrible place at times. And and also the amount of time I'd spend on it, just constantly scrolling.
Mm-hmm.
So I came off it, and then because I knew I wanted to do this podcast, I had to go back on, which was really annoying at some point. Hopefully I can come back off it again. But Stuart was one of the first things I saw, the fact that he'd announced this Style Council book. And I thought, okay, look, it'd probably be quite easy to get hold of him and be able to interview him for this thing. And initially, maybe I was thinking it was like a pilot or something. I don't know if I even thought it would go out in the world. I just thought, let me connect with him, do the interview. Let's get a couple in the can. That's right. Let's get a couple in the can, see what it sounds like, see if this could be a thing. So there was him. There was a guy called Mark Baxter, because at that point, I think the Style Council documentary had just been on or was about to be on. So I interviewed him, and those two were in the can. And then maybe I think the third one was Russell Hastings from the Jam.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they were all in the can maybe before it even went live, because I was just seeing, like, is it a thing? Could it work? Get a few done. Okay, yeah, there's something in this. I mean, now if I was to listen, I had to listen back to them to transcribe them for the book, because to use some of the content, and they're all over the shop. But I guess most podcasts are at the beginning, right? Unless you're kind of like huge budgets behind you, and So yeah, I was just trying to work it out and figure it out, really. But bless him, I just messaged him, and I think he had doubts because the title of the podcast was called "Desperately Seeking Paul," and this idea that
I think that's a brilliant title as well.
Well, I quite liked the fact that a lot of people when it went live went, well, that's a stupid title. You'll never get Paul with that. Because I thought it's like, it stands out. You don't want to be kind of beige and in the background. It's like people, and actually the people, even though we haven't called it that for a little while because we've done a couple of series since, people still call it Desperately Seeking Paul, even though we found him.
And so through those like first initial guests, were they the ones that were then able to kind of give you the connections moving forward?
I think so. Yeah, Bax would have introduced me to Lee Cogswell, who was his production partner, and Lee talked about that Style Council documentary. Lee had also done some other films for Weller and Camp and stuff as well. So but yeah, it just started kind of snowballing really. As soon as it went live, it became a lot easier. And obviously with social media these days, you can kind of, I mean, you DM'd me. It's like very easy to kind of just go into a Facebook Messenger and message people. Now, don't get me wrong, I've messaged loads of people who've never got back to me, or I've been introduced to them by other people who have been on the podcast and whatever, and people going, oh yeah, it's legit. It is actually a thing. But yeah, it just became quite easy to kind of message people and get them to come on. And I guess that's testament to Paul Weller as well, in a sense that people were happy to kind of come and chat about him and wanted to be involved and all that,
Did you, obviously, like being a fan of Paul Weller, you must have knew there was so much content in it. Like there's so many different aspects to Paul. Like obviously the Jam and the Style Council, but even once you get into his solo career, you
Mm.
could probably cut that into 3 or 4 different chunks.
Yes.
So, um, did you envision it then going the 180 episodes of the first run? And at the start, did you kind of ever think that getting Paul was a viable
No, not in a million
option?
years. No, I mean, I thought it might be. I guess I had faith in the sense of my skills as an interviewer and knowing that I'd be able to get some good content throughout however long it ran. But no, I didn't. I didn't think we'd get Weller. That would be nuts, really. And if I had, I probably would have started in maybe a different way. I don't know, but I think it was. Yeah, it just kind of exploded really. Nikki Weller came on for episode 12. I think around 70 we had Kenny Wheeler. So Kenny was the kind of old school bouncer guy for the Jam, became tour manager, is still working with Weller HQ these days. And Weller, who's Paul's mum, who sadly passed away a couple of months ago, Paul and Nikki's mum. She was episode 100. So you did feel it kind of this momentum kind of building, if you like. And everywhere I went, it was funny, people would kind of come up to me at gigs because they recognised the back of my head somehow, because I'm in the front row, and go, listen to the podcast and whatever. It just became mad. And also I understood, because I bump into people, that people were asking Paul about it more and talking to Paul about it more, which seems insane, doesn't it? But I think, so I think probably he was bullied into it to a certain extent by the audience.
Well, I mean, like, looking at some of the names, like I've wrote down some that stand out to me, like episodes that stand out to me. Obviously, Bruce Foxton and Rick Buckler,
Hmm.
um, Nicky and Anne, as you've mentioned, Steve Brooks, um, Pete Paphides, Pat Gilbert. I've been trying to get Pat on this podcast as well. John Wilson, obviously, I've listened to all his master tapes. So to get a guy like that on the podcast is a major coup. Or Mick Talbot, Gary Crowley, PP Arnold stands out. Obviously, she's back. She's just done the vocals recast for their latest single.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Um, Kenny Wheeler, you mentioned, Anna Joy David with the Red Wedge stuff, Billy Bragg, Simon Fowler. A couple that I had on, I've had the Magic Mod and I've had Damon Manchella. So, I mean, you've got all these, but out of the 180 episodes as well, some of the people that I didn't know, and then you get to know these people as well. It's just there's so much content there. Is like obviously you would probably pick Anne or Nicky, but what other episodes would stand out to you?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, Anna Joy David, you mentioned, so the lady who collaborated with Billy Bragg and Paul on Red Wedge, was really interesting because I think that whole kind of political side of Weller and the 80s and what was going on and how they created that was kind of fascinating, that story of that. There were sometimes people would come on and they'd have a little story or a little connection. And I guess I really enjoyed those sometimes because, my family would tell you there's a lot to talk about Paul Weller in our house. And that must get a bit irritating, quite a lot irritating, I would imagine. To the point my mum, my wife was like, come on now, I was still talking about the book. And it's like, it was only just come out Thursday. Come on, I think I can still talk about it, right? So I think sometimes, and also sometimes if you're doing a podcast and you're talking about the same topic over and over again, which was Paul Weller ultimately, it was quite nice sometimes to have those conversations with somebody who maybe had a brief connection, but then you could expand out on their wider career. So people like, I'm trying to think now, Dr. Robert from the Blow Monkeys, he's got a great, amazing career himself that isn't all Paul Weller. So yes, you connect on the Paul Weller stories, but hearing some of his stories, Billy Bragg's another one actually. There's a lot of stuff about Weller, but actually a load of stuff about Billy. And I'm a fan of Billy as well. Chris Difford, another one, there are these little connections. But actually, you can then expand it out and delve into Chris Difford and how he writes songs and stuff like that. So I was always trying to think of how can I make this interesting for the listener outside of Weller world. Now, it's unlikely that if you're not a fan of Paul Weller, you'd listen to my podcast. But what I wanted to make sure is that if you were, you didn't have to be a massive super fan to listen and get something from it. It would be of interest to people who maybe liked a few of his songs. And at times there would still be enough in that kind of that episode with that guest to inform, educate, entertain, whatever. So there's a bit of that as well. And then some of the other ones I really enjoyed were people who, like, were new artists. So people like Nia Wynn, who's this brilliant kind of amazing, I don't know what she's called, neo soul, I think they call it. This Welsh lady, and just brilliant. And people like Gweno and Dot Allison, these kind of real Catherine Williams, these real kind of talented, forceful, brilliantly innovative women doing this in a what is still a kind of relatively male dominated industry, and they're kind of smashing it. So people like that were really interesting as well, I think.
I've looked at Nia Win a few times as well. I've had Megan Win on my
Yeah,
podcast.
yeah, yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
sure, are they two
I
related?
don't know if they're related. I don't
Because
think
obviously
so. But Megan
Megan
Wynn's
Win
great
was
as well.
Welsh as
Yeah,
well. So
yeah.
obviously you've done like some live events as well. So how did that feel, kind of doing that?
That felt like back on the radio seat of your pants thing, because I think obviously the advantage of a podcast is you're pre-recording. I can edit out the ums and ers and hopefully make me sound half decent at the end of it, which I hope is what you're going to do, Martin, as well. With me, not with you. But the live event, you're in front of an audience. So we did, the first one was with Gary Crowley, you mentioned, and it was with a guy called Steve Tufty Carver, who's one of Paul's best mates from back in the day. They kind of, right at the beginning of the Jam, Paul Weller moved house and his back garden plugged onto the back garden of Tufty, and they became really great mates, and they still are now. And we did this live event, which Stuart organised, actually. He just asked me if we wanted to do a live event at the Cockpit in London. And yeah, I just turned up and I had all my prep and whatever, and you don't know if an audience is actually going to come to it, but they did. And that was amazing. It was a real buzz. And I think we did a couple of others. I'm trying to think now. Peter Anderson, who was the photographer of the Style Council right at the beginning. Smiler, actually, the mod guy. Yeah, that's a real buzz. We did, as part of the book launch last week, John Wilson interviewed me. He introduced the whole thing. And then we had a panel of guests, people like Andy McDonald from Go Discs, Malcolm Gerry, who did The Tube, Jack O'Peak, who's part of Weller's band, Claire Moon, Paul's manager, and a guy called Spanner, who's like a legendary plugger. And it's you've got like, and that was like an audience of about 200 people who had made it through the wind and the rain and the tube strikes to get there. And that's a real seat of your pants thing. I mean, that's great. And actually, often what I find with those, you have loads and loads of notes, because I do loads of research and have all that. But actually on this week, I did all that, bits of that. But I didn't use any of them because the conversation just flows and you kind of think of new things. So yeah, that's a real kind of, I'd hope there's a bit of an art to it, but it is a real kind of fun thing to do. Terrifying at times, but fun.
Well, I mean, like any podcast you've done, even for the start, I always thought it sounded really, really relaxed and like
Thank you.
you knew what you were doing. Some of the things you've done as well for the podcast, like a lot of things that I do, like maybe if I've recorded a bunch of episodes, and because kind of I try and release weekly, but sometimes you don't get a guest or whatever. Some, like obviously in the summer, trying to get musicians is really hard with festivals. So sometimes I'll not release for 2 or 3 months, but then other times, as I say, you get a big bunch. So like over Easter, I think I released Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. And I've seen that you've done that, obviously, like the honorary councillors. You've done
Yeah, I just was playing with the
7
kind
episodes
of,
in 7 days, didn't you?
yeah, I did, yeah, and I was playing with the kind of, I guess, the format. Also, at that point, for some reason, I ended up having a load of in the can, and I thought
Yeah.
this is going to take, because also I think at that point lockdown maybe was opening up again, and I had all these in the can, and I was like, I need to get these out, otherwise I'm just gonna be running this podcast for the next 3 years. Little did I know at the time. So yeah, but I think, the general advice is not to do that, because at that point, actually, it kind of messed with the numbers a bit, because the audience kind of went, well, there's too much. What's going on? I've lost the story. Where is it? Whatever. But then I did the same thing on 66, with the
Yeah,
album.
because I was going to touch on that 21 episodes.
Yeah, I just
in one day.
released them all as a box set, but generally it's not a great idea, that. But
The thing is, like for me as a podcaster and as a fan of podcasts, like that's like a dream to me, especially as I mentioned, see working night shift and getting into work and think, oh look, there's 21 episodes, that'll do me the full night. So I love that, and that I think that's seeing you doing things like that. That's how I was like, right, well, I'm going to release 5 episodes in 5 days, or I'm going to, like, so
Yeah, mine was I've
I
got
mean,
too
I've
much
never really
content.
looked at the numbers either. I've never really bothered looking at the numbers to worry about whether.
No, you can get a bit obsessed with that, and it's funny with the book stuff. I've started, over the weekend. It was like refreshing Amazon every half an hour. You can get a bit obsessed, and I don't bother looking at the podcast numbers now at all because it's like you're never going to win against. I'm not going to beat Gary Lineker's podcast or This Is Entertainment. It's just like I know that people listen because they message me, and that's fine.
Hmm. So obviously, like all these episodes, and then it came and you announced the final three. Charles Reese, the producer, engineer of Black Barn Studios, Claire Moon, Paul's manager, and then Paul himself. Um, I thought all three episodes were fantastic, but probably the one that I liked best out of the three was Claire.
Hmm.
Round about that time, I was managing a band, so she just getting her kind of insight, and obviously, like I was managing a grassroots band, I wasn't managing Paul Weller, but just getting her insight into that was integral for me at the time. Um, how enjoyable was it getting those three, and how nervous were you finally kind of coming to get to Paul?
Yeah, not nervous actually. That's really. I think it was lovely to. It was always a buzz if you get somebody who's never shared their story before. So people like Kenny, people like Anne, having those kind of people who have never been on anything and probably never would either. They're not, they would never have done anything apart from that conversation. And Charles hadn't really been on thing. So he was really up for doing it, but it was earning their trust that made it happen really. And I think, with Claire, again, she was really nervous. She was really nervous at the event last week, but it's that trust to kind of let me do it and me going, look, I'm not going to make you look an idiot. You can have a think and I can edit it out. If you say anything and you want to redo it, it's sort of cool. And actually neither of them did, don't get me wrong, but it was just making it a safe space, I guess, and knowing that I'm not Paxman. I'm not trying to trip them up. Not that there are an awful lot of skeletons in the closet anyway, right?
Yeah.
Although Claire did say to me that she knows where the bodies are buried. But no, it wasn't nervous, and I think even with Paul, because I'd done kind of at that point, 179 episodes of preparation, if you like. It felt very relaxed, and he's so lovely and down to earth and just really welcoming, and was really open to it and kind of, from the first question, he was just kind of, he didn't give kind of these really short answers. I knew it was going to be good because he opened up immediately, which is what you want from any guest, right?
Hmm. And that's the thing with somebody like Paul as well. Like the only other thing, I think I heard him on, did he do John Wilson's master tapes? Pretty sure he did
Mm-hmm.
that. But other than that, I don't think I've really heard them interviewed. Maybe like the odd time, like maybe on telly. But when you get those interviews on telly, you're talking 5, 10 minutes at max. So other than John Wilson, you're the only one that I've been able to hear a proper sit down insight into the man himself.
Mm.
And it did, as you say, it did sound so relaxed. You were probably more an expert on Paul than he was.
I think he said that. He said, "You'll know this more than me." Yeah, a couple of times.
Um, so, like, getting that, was that just, did you think that was the end of it? And then obviously 66 comes along. How long after that was it that
So they were all wrapped up in the same day. Actually, let me get this. Let me think. So yes, essentially what happened was I interviewed Paul, and so I bumped into Paul at a gig in the summer of 2023. And at the end of our conversation, he said, "Let's do it Christmas special." So the following morning, Claire emailed me saying, "I hear you bumped into Paul last night. Should we get it sorted?" And then as we got closer to it, I think we must have recorded maybe in November. She said, we're announcing a new album in the new year. Actually, this must have been, I think maybe February, something like that. Paul would like you to hear it and we'd like you to interview him. Why don't we do it all on the same day?" So basically what happened was I did my bit and Claire said, "Look, if see how it goes. If you get 45 minutes, you get an hour. Brilliant." We ended up doing 2. Could have gone longer. She then went, and then we took a bit of a break. Paul had a cup of tea and a fag. and we did a conversation for 66. And by that point, I'd been sent it. I could hear it. And they wanted a track by track, and they were going to use it in their marketing. That's right. So it wasn't necessarily a thing for me. It was just like, look, if you wouldn't mind doing this, we're going to use it on the video and all that. So that all was all the same day. And then I did, obviously my podcast went out just before Christmas, and then they saved all their stuff. And we then did the 66 stuff in 2024 when the album was announced. And when the album came out, I ran that podcast.
And I mean, some cracking guests on that as well. Obviously, Suggs and Gallagher standards, but even like the young boy Josh McClory used to be in the Stripes. So I that name came up straight away. I recognised that name, and kind of getting like a younger perspective on it as well was so good. And then at what point did the book come along?
They were all actually, that was around about the same time. So what happened was, off the back of actually when I met Paul in the bar or the club for this gig. So it was King's Place in London. It was a club or event music venue, and I went out into the garden. I grabbed a beer, went out into the garden, and Jack O'Peak was there with Tom Hill from the band, and I just went over to them, and Paul was just around a little pillar around the corner. And I went, oh, hello, didn't know he was there. And then we got chatting, and he said, it's amazing what you've been doing. The podcast's incredible. Like, everybody you've spoken to, you need to turn it into a book. So at that point, he said it. And then, so when I then was doing press for what was the final episode of Desperately Seeking Paul, if you like, because it kind of exploded. I don't know if you remember. So what happened was, I got Paul in the can on that Monday. It was like the 20th of November or something like that. And I then went live, on the podcast and on my social channels, going, look, this has been a long time. It's been 3 years, and I rewrote the Jam. The announcement when Paul split the Jam. I rewrote that and kind of parodied it to basically announce that the podcast was going to come to an end. And I say, look, it's going to come to the end with final 3 episodes, kicking off with Charles Reese type thing, and everybody went crazy. Like, the world went mad. And people were like messaging, and they were saying how furious they was that Paul wasn't going to do it, because I had announced that Paul would be the final guest. And then the Guardian rang, going, "Look, we reckon we can help you get Paul Weller. We've seen that you've announced the podcast coming to an end. We reckon we can help you." And I was like, "Well, look, let me let you into the secret. I've already got Paul Weller, and he's going to be the final episode." So they then, bless them, they then did a big article about the fact that, revealing that Paul Weller was going to be the final episode, and it went out on this Saturday, and it was in the newspaper. And as part of that, I mentioned that Paul had also said to turn it into a book. And then I was on ITV News, ridiculously, Evening News, and they interviewed me, and they said, what's next? And I said, Paul said to turn it into a book. And then at that point, suddenly all these publishers started getting in touch with me, going, "We hear you want to turn it into a book. We're interested. So I had to get an agent. And he was like, let's do it properly. It's like, this could be a book of the transcripts of the podcast, but that's easy. I didn't want to do that. There's no real value in that for me at all. And I think that's a bit kind of cheating the fans as well. So he was like, look, let's do a proper proposal. Let's put it to the market. And then all the publishers were kind of, wanting to do it and stuff. So we ended up working with a brilliant publisher called Little Brown, part of the Hachette Group, Andreas and his team, to create the book,
And what sort of work then goes into that? Because obviously I've heard that, obviously, as you say, it touches on the podcast, but there's people involved in the book that haven't been on the podcast, like Steve Craddock. So what sort of work then goes into doing something like that? Because obviously you've never released a book before, so
no,
it's a learning curve.
So I don't know if this is the right way of doing it or not, but this is how I did it. So there were 2 kind of runs going at the same time, I guess. There was the I need to interview more people, because there were people who hadn't featured on the podcast that, for availability, or maybe weren't interested or couldn't get hold of. So there was this kind of like, and also I knew that I wanted it to be more than the podcast, like I say. So there was this kind of running track of, let me get more interviews, let me interview other people. And that was people like, I got Lenny Henry and Jack D and Malcolm Gerry from The Tube, and loads of different people. Jim Cook, the guy who signed the Jam to Polydor. So there's this run going here. The second run was, at no point during the podcast as I transcribed them. So I had all these podcasts which weren't transcribed, which obviously, to turn it into a book, I need to get the written words. So the kind of podcast army, if you like, the people who listen to the podcast, helps me, bless them. and you can computer generate transcripts these days. You upload the audio, it sends it back. They're about 70% there. They're not great yet still. So I put them in, download it, and then I'd be listening and typing, or fans of the podcast would be listening and typing, and we'd just kind of, so it basically got into a place where we had all the transcripts, right, along with all these extra interviews going on. And then I basically took all the bits about and put it into the right order. So I started with Anne Weller meeting John Weller, and right the way through to now. And I put all these little clips, all these little segments into the right place. So if somebody was talking about Wildwood, you'd then have all the different voices talking about Wildwood. And you kind of make it, needed to make it flow as a narrative. And so that one story flows into the next. And it sounds like everybody's in the pub and they're all building on each other's stories, or they're contradicting each other. And so that was how I did it. And it basically ended up to be 1.5 million words at one point. It was just massive. And then you edit down. And there were people who looked at it and went, yeah, you're on the right track or not. By this point, we'd had the publisher on board. I was working with agents. So just kind of get it into a place where it could actually become a book. That was the biggest challenge because it's so long. And I managed to get it to the point where the book is kind of at breaking. It's not a breaking point, but it's like, if it was any longer, it would be too long. And it's like the perfect length to make it fit in a book. But that was the challenge of like, how do you condense this all into a book that can, and so it's not tiny text, because you probably got those as well, right? You get like a book on your favorite artist and the text, you need a magnifying glass to read it. It's not that. I wanted people to be able to read it properly and for it to be a fun light read as well, Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing.
Oh, bless you. Yeah.
It's an absolutely beautiful thing. But what I would say, the pages are really thin, so you probably fit more words in that way. That's how the paper's so lovely and smooth, and it's beautiful, man.
Yeah, imagine, it's funny though, because that came through, we went right up to the wire as well on like the deadline. Just because I think on the day I had to submit, I got the head of Warner, whose name escapes me now, that's bad, but Tony Harlow. And he, on the morning of I needed to submit the final of the book, he came back and said, oh yeah, I'm happy to be interviewed this morning. So I interviewed him, transcribed it, put it in the right places, and actually Paul had just signed to Parlophone again for the final album, the latest album. So it was crucial for me, and I put it in and then submitted. But yeah, then a few weeks later, it came back as an actual book, which is nuts. It's like beautiful, this thing, crazy.
And from that, obviously, there has been other releases, as you say, so like Jack D. I just listened to Tim Burgess one last week as well. So what's the journey for the podcast going forward?
I'm not sure. I'll be 100% honest. I can't quite decide, because I think there's that kind of thing. I quite like the fact that a lot of these interviews are for the book, and maybe that's a separate thing. So I don't know I don't think these will all be podcasts. I'm not sure. I don't know. I haven't decided. I'm on the fence.
I think we need to keep hearing your voice for these.
Well, you might not be able to close me down on that. I've got some other ideas for podcasts and stuff. Maybe not some linked to Weller World, some not. I don't know. It's the honest answer. It's been so time consuming. It's been like every evening, every weekend. It's been a lot of sacrifice, family life. I've got 2 young kids, so I've not seen as much as I should have done. I think it needs, and you don't want to outstay your welcome on these things either, right? I think there's an element where, you should come off for a bit and come back and see what people think or whatever. I don't know. We'll see. It's this. It's like even the podcast itself was so time consuming research, and if I was to do something else, I'd want it to be more of you just can rock up and chat rather than kind of the hours of research and editing and all that.
But if Paul gets in contact with you and says, right, the new album, I want you to do something similar to we did with 66, then you'd be there in a heartbeat, yeah?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. I think there's also that thing of you don't want to be the guy that's always rocking up for the interview, right, as well, because I think it's like, don't get me wrong, there's still a billion questions I would love to ask Paul and talk to Paul about. But I often see where, even when he has a new album out, he's rotating around the people that he talks to on Uncut Magazine and Mojo and stuff. So, because, you want different angles. So, I mean, yes, absolutely. If Paul says tomorrow he's announcing a new album and they want me to do anything, or they'd be up for me doing anything, I'm more than happy, don't get me wrong. But I do think you don't want to kind of overplay your hand to a certain extent and create something, I don't want to come back for whatever the next album is and then not get him, because you then look a bit crap, right? So it's like, I just want it to, the book is so special. It's such an amazing thing to have, from a personal point of view, to have done. The fact that people seem to love it is incredible as well. And if that became the kind of almost like the full stop for a while, that's fine.
Yeah, listen, you shouldn't feel guilty about going and sitting and putting your feet up for a bit. The work, obviously the work going into the podcast, and then, as I say, such a beautiful book, such a detailed book, then you're probably due a well-earned holiday.
Yeah, there is that. It's funny, one of the things Paul said to me, he asked me, first time I met him, he asked me how old I was. And at that point, I'd have been 48, and I said, I'm going to be. So how I phrased it was, I'm going to be 50 in a couple of years. I don't know why I phrased it that way. And he went, "Oh, big one, that's a big one." Oh, and I went, "Yeah, you did 22 Dreams. It's all right for you." But now I'm going to be 50 in December. I've done this book, and that's, for me, it's like that's my 22 Dreams. That's not a bad way to go out on all this,
Yeah, totally. Obviously, as the podcast goes out, I'll post links to your podcast. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned your podcast in a few of my episodes anyway, but I'll post links for that. I'll post a link for the book, but just for the listeners that are on the now, where can they get the book?
I mean, it's amazing. So I think up to about 3 months ago, my mum, I think, thought I was kind of printing this thing in my home bedroom and sending it to people. It's an actual proper book in bookshops. So Amazon, Waterstones, have it in store, online, all the independent bookshops. So if you want to support your local, you can go to bookshops.org. You can look up your local. You can get, do a click and collect, make sure they get it in. So you can actually go and buy a physical copy in their shop and support those independents in the same way as it's great to support the independent record shops, right? People like Rough Trade have got it in right now. So yeah, pretty much everywhere that you can buy books in the UK. We've also got it across Europe as well, so you can get it across all of the... Oh, you got the extra postcard for Rough Trade, right?
I got mine for Rough Trade. It was my birthday last Tuesday, so that's the missus got me that for my birthday.
Nice. Oh,
she was raging with me because... obviously, it was her birthday a week before, and I got her all this stuff to open. And then when it came to my birthday, obviously she got me a book that wasn't out. She got me everything that I asked for, basically. So she got me that. She got me a Patreon membership for a podcast. So there was nothing to wrap there. And she got me a tattoo voucher. So she's like, I've got all this stuff, but there's nothing to wrap. It's just bits of paper. And I'm like, but that's what I like. I was happy with her. So I had to wait a couple of days for this book dropping through the door, but it's absolute genius. So I shall post links, but I got mine for Rough Trade. It's got a wee signature in it as well.
Oh, you got a signed copy. Yeah, those are great. I've not got the postcard yet, funny enough. They're meant to be sending one. But yeah, and I think, if you're supporting Rough Trade, my understanding is that Paul has an account at Rough Trade as well himself for records and new records and stuff. So it's almost got the Weller stamp of approval, Rough Trade. So it's not a bad place to get it from.
Brilliant. So as I say, I post links to all that for all the listeners. They can click the links. But the last part of the podcast, obviously, it's called Time for Heroes. And I asked my guests to pick 4 heroes to come for dinner. Why they're your heroes and what would you cook for them? Dead or alive, obviously, musicians, sports people, whatever you like. And I see that just when I was clicking through your Instagram earlier, and I seen you posted like a Chelsea thing. So are you a Chelsea fan?
I'm a Chelsea fan for my sins.
Yeah, so I'm a Chelsea fan as well. So there's that connection there. But so musicians, sports people, whatever you like.
It's really hard, that question, because there are so many from so many bits of the things that I love. So not just Weller, but like you say, Chelsea. So you could go, Frank Lampard. My eldest is called Henry Frank. Frank's his middle name. And Frank after Lamps from Chelsea. Mm-hmm. But, people like Zola and Drogba and all that. So you could cover the football. there's a million musicians and artists I love in that sense, and not just Weller, but people like Dr. Robert you mentioned, and you could go down the kind of Lennon and McCartney and Bowie and all those kind of people, right? So I love all that, but I think in keeping with the Weller thing, I think there are four people who are kind of central to the book. So it feels like maybe this is a bit of a cop out, but there are two. John Weller, Paul's dad, and his manager comes through so much. It's as much his story as it is Paul at times. And from the support that he gave Paul and the family, and just kind of just everything, like the question you asked me at the beginning of the podcast, like my upbringing and stuff. He just did everything he could to make ends meet, to make sure there was food on the table, and comes through as an absolute hero. So, and John passed away in 2009. Is that right? So John Weller would be at my table. I'd also pick Anne Weller because Anne is John's wife for so many years, but Anne passed away a few months back, and I was lucky enough to interview Anne on episode 100, and I spent time with her at the Woking Weekender. Got to sit next to her. We shared a cheese board, and she's just such a cracking lady, and just a brilliant company, and just so lovely. So I then was like, well, hold on, I need to make it like a Weller table because this is going to be weird. Like, obviously Paul's my ultimate hero and why I wanted to do the podcast in the first place. So to not have Paul at the table would be weird, right? And, and there are still so many stories that I know about and we want to ask him about. So Paul for the music and the stories, John for the kind of the hustle, the humor, the honesty, and actually, we'd probably end up in some kind of mad card game at the end, and he'd make sure everybody was on the Black Russians and all that. Anne for the kind of warmth and the family, and she was the proper glue in the Weller family. And I know, so missed already, and she's seen it all, and she had the best anecdotes because she could tell it like it is. So then I feel like I was then like, oh, wouldn't it be great to have John Lennon at the table? Because obviously John passed away or was murdered in 1980. Mm-hmm. He would be wicked. Paul would really connect with him. John Weller would. And I was like, no, I can't have the three Wellers and not have Nicky. So John Lennon's out the door. It's Nicky Weller. Because again, I think somebody says this brilliantly in the book. I can't remember who exactly. I'll have to look this up. But they talked about like. Imagine like you have like an Olympic swimmer now, and they're like so brilliant at swimming, and the whole family. When this kid was good at swimming, the whole family geared up around the swimmer, and they went to all the swimming galas, and every Tuesday and Thursday and whatever rehearsals and all that. I feel like that's the Wellers really, where Paul and his music. The rest of the family kind of sacrificed so much. They were gigging every night
and stuff like that.
Yeah, Nicky and that were doing they were like replying to like 5,000 letters for the fanzine, and but also Nicky's been part of the merch team, and she's organised all the exhibitions. So just really kind of absolutely crucial. And she's also got a kind of unique perspective on it. But also, when you get four members of the same family together, particularly people like that, you get this banter and you get the kind of, and you see a different side to Paul that you don't see in the kind of normal press interviews, because they'd all be taking the piss out of him and they'd all be reminding him of when he did that ridiculous thing or whatever. And him and Nicky kind of always had this brilliant love relationship, but at times they've had fallouts. So you could get all this juicy stuff around the table and this kind of mischief and stuff. So yeah, they would be my four heroes.
That's brilliant. That's, I mean, it just sit around that and be part of that family for.
Yeah,
that would be phenomenal. And what would you cook for them? Are you kind of with having dealings with them? You must be kind of.
I'm gonna cheat. So I'm not gonna cook. I'm gonna bring in, if that's all right. So as part of the podcast, you might have heard this, and it gets mentioned in albums quite often, whereby they will thank the Ripley Curry Garden,
right,
which is the curry place in Ripley. It's been there donkey's years, actually. And Ripley is where Paul's studio is. It's where Anne Weller lived up until recent months. And I've never been there, and I've not been invited there yet by Paul or anything. So, but the band will always get taken there whenever they go. The amount of people who mentioned to me about the Ripley Curry Garden. So I would take them all out there, and we'll go out there for a curry meal.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. on BBC at some point. Is that correct? I was kind of to and fro to see
Yeah,
who
we've been on
the
BBC
interviews
local
were.
radio, all bits and pieces. Ridiculously, I'm on five live at midnight tonight with Tony Livesey. So yeah, I'll be popping up all over the place, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So, as I say, I'll post all the links to the book and the podcast for anybody that's been living under a rock and hasn't listened to these. And for anybody that wants to go and buy the book, all the links will be in the show notes. But as I says, it's an absolute beautiful book. I can't wait to actually get it open and get my head in about it. Absolute pleasure listening to you, and thanks for coming on the podcast, and looking forward to seeing what you do next. But thank you very much.
I want to thank you for asking me, man. I really appreciate it. It's been lovely. Cheers.
Cheers, man. Thank you. I hope you all enjoyed this episode of Time for Heroes podcast. If you would like to get in touch, the best way is on the Facebook page, Time for Heroes podcast, or on Instagram at Time for Heroes podcast, or Twitter at Time for Heroes P1, or drop me an email at timeforheroespod@gmail.com. You'll find Time for Heroes on all podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple, Google and Amazon. Please leave a review where you can, share with others, and more importantly, enjoy.